Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We're here today to talk about buried above ground concealed artifacts in Virginia's Piedmont. A wide range of curious artifacts have occasionally been found within the walls and foundations during renovation and demolition of historic buildings in Orange County, the greater Virginia Piedmont, and beyond. Professional archaeologists and historians are only now beginning to recognize that many of these items have been intentionally concealed, some of which may be associated with apotropaic ritual or sympathetic magic. This presentation will survey and describe a number of artifacts or a number of objects recovered from the bowels of 19th century structures and provide context from which to draw some basic conclusions regarding their placement in these unseen spaces. First of all, we need to define the word apotropaic. Apotropaic is defined as having the ability to divert evil influences or harm or protection magic. Artifacts placed in and around buildings for ritual purposes have been documented in many places around the world and is likely to have risen from the practice of a form of folk magic. For instance, in Great Britain, folk magic ritualism was especially widespread and may have been a vector for transmission for some of these same practices to British North America during the 18th century. Another brand of folk magic was also likely to have been transmitted with the importation of African slaves into the Americas from the Caribbean and Africa as well. Unfortunately, a comprehensive scholarly examination of the psychology that propped up this ritualism is lacking. One especially common artifact of ritual concealment that came to be practiced in North America surrounded leather shoes. An 1870 article entitled "The Superstitions of the Negro" contained a compilation of superstitions attributed to African Americans from the Charleston area of South Carolina. The article reported to have about a house some place of deposit for old shoes, and therein to keep all the worn out leather of the household will bring good luck to the family. Although this article associates the concealment of shoes with African Americans in the 19th century, the practice was adopted earlier in Great Britain. In the United States, over 200 individual occurrences of hidden shoes from the 19th century have been documented by scholars, with most of these being from the Northeast region. This probably reflects a sampling bias rather than the true distribution of this type of concealment. This practice was in reality much more widespread in the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, in Virginia, and the Upper South along the Appalachian Mountains. There also appears to have been a preference for the concealment of left shoes and the shoes of children, but there has not been enough detailed study to make an accurate determination. Shoe caches were also common. Shoes have been found mostly within voids in the skeletal structures of buildings. These include near fireplaces, chimneys, within walls, and beneath floorboards. In one example, a man's shoe was found in the cornice of the Brafferton Hall building in Williamsburg on the campus of the College of William and Mary. The Brafferton Hall building was built in 1723. Most shoes that have been found in hidden context have been heavily used and worn, but sometimes the shoes were ritually destroyed or killed before the fragments were placed behind walls or under floors. Although it is difficult to determine the full extent of the meaning of this activity, it was certainly a means to practice a form of ritual or sympathetic magic intended for protection, healing, control, or harm. Unfortunately, it is difficult for modern scholarship to fully realize and understand the psychology and the symbolism of these activities. A hidden cache also of this type was discovered in a house in Saltville, Virginia, and included 4 shoes, 2 gloves, a jacket, a corset, a bow tie, and an umbrella. All of these were recovered from inside the wall surrounding the door of the structure. Obviously, these were not concealed here by accident and were not meant to be retrieved from their final resting place. They were probably placed there as part of some unknown ritual. Concealed artifacts are not limited to inanimate objects. At the John Carlisle House in Alexandria, Virginia, a dried cat was discovered inside the chimney foundation and was accompanied by a bunch of dried lavender. This also tells us that this was an intentional placement. Now, in and around Orange County, there have been several instances of hidden or concealed items within the frameworks of structures. A collection of 19th century leather shoes was recovered in 2017 from the second-story subfloor of an 1820s era house in Hood in Madison County, Virginia. This house had been a Shiflett family homestead. The cache of shoes contained 9 adult and children's shoes and other artifacts, including 3 wood spools, 1 silvered metal container, 1 small blue glass cup, 1 clear glass patent medicine bottle, and 1/2 of a hand-painted saucer. I did not do an analysis of the shoes to determine whether these shoes were left-footed or right-footed primarily, but there are both left and right in the collection. Although many of these items were typical of the time period and were widely available, items of this type have been commonly found in concealed locations in Virginia and in other places. We don't have a good grasp of why these particular artifacts were cached together, how any of them contributed to any sympathetic magic or ritual, or who may have hid them there. The only thing that is certain is that they were placed there intentionally. In addition to shoes and seemingly mundane domestic items, other types of artifacts have also been found in concealed contexts within buildings, including toys, tools, documents, ceramics, glass, coins, iron objects, and etc. As in the case of the cache from the 1820s Shiflett house in Hood, a number of different kinds of items were occasionally hidden together as well. At Litchfield, the 1840s home associated with the Madisons of Orange, several interesting items were discovered when the house was disassembled and moved from its historic location in the present Orange County Industrial Park to a new location west of the town of Orange. Many woodworking artifacts were found in voids behind plaster and lath along the wall separating the central passage from one of the parlor rooms. These may have been intentionally dropped into the void spaces during construction of the second floor. The construction used enslaved labor and craftsmen, and one explanation may be the loss of these tools was a way that enslaved workers were able to push back against the system that enslaved them. Less work can get done if there weren't any tools to do the work, or the workmen were able to create extended downtime while new tools were being brought to the site. You can see here we have wooden mallets, chisels and gouges, and steel hammers. These are all these items are in extremely good shape due to the fact that they were encapsulated, so to speak, within the wall of this home. Here are some additional artifacts from the Litchfield house. A carpenter's compass, another chisel, a hand saw, which this is an artifact that's in really great shape. Some finger puppets, which we're going to mention next, that don't necessarily equate with the tools from this time period. These were found in another room or under another room in the house. And of course, a shoe, which is a common theme, spoons, common theme, and what's slightly unique is that this is a complete plate, not a plate that's been broken. So again, these things tell us that these objects were placed here on purpose. They probably were not, didn't make their way there accidentally. Other artifacts also found concealed in the Litchfield house included the finger puppets, which date to the 1940s, plate, spoon, and shoe, and also incidentally the house, or a portion of the house, served as a school during the 19th century. A relatively common artifact type found within timber frame structures in both Great Britain and the United States, and hence Orange County, is a hexafoil, also known as a daisy wheel. These are small geometric figures, usually enclosed by a circle, drawn or scribed onto wooden timbers or flooring, most commonly at or near windows, doors, or chimneys, where these openings pierced the structures. An experienced Orange County timber frame tradesman has encountered a number of these hexafoils on timber frame structures in the Virginia Piedmont over the previous 20 years. Given that the hexafoils are typically found in similar places across a range of buildings in different geographic locations, this type of concealed artifact can easily be attributable to ritual or apotropaic activity. It's a little hard to discern this daisy wheel here, the circle with the leaves drawn, inscribed. This was from a second floor bedchamber on the north side of a dormer framing from a 1782, so an 18th century house in Albemarle County. And here actually is a series of more than one hexafoil. Here's the main one. Here's the central portion with the leaves, and here is the remnants of a second hexafoil there, which is not quite as well done. This hexafoil was found on a floor joist and hidden after the plaster and lath was installed as the house was constructed. This house was from Orange County, or is in Orange County, and dates to about 1820. At the Gilmore cabin on the James Madison's Montpelier property, a unique set of artifacts was found below the floor joist near the front door to the structure. A set of 3 Noah's Ark animal figurines were found when the structure was being rehabilitated. The cabin dates to just after the Civil War and was constructed by newly freed slaves of the Gilmore family that had worked on the Montpelier property. The figurines are hand-carved from wood and probably date to sometime during the late 19th century. Other examples of concealed objects at Montpelier includes a large fragment of quartz crystal and a clear glass tumbler base hidden at the threshold of the door and in the interior corner of a slave cabin in the South Yard quarter adjacent to the main house at Montpelier. These photos on the left and the right show an in situ view when these 3 figurines were actually found during rehabilitation. And it's interesting, I presume that the investigators looked for maybe the ark and maybe some other different kinds of animal figurines, but none were ever found. So those had apparently been lost, or maybe they never were part of this set in the first place. We don't know, but this shows a very good photo of the relationship of where these items were found in relation to the other members of the house, and I mean the other components, architectural components of the house itself. Here's the door, the floor joist, the log seal under here, some of the other logs. So they were placed or left here. It's just a very interesting location for these items. Plus, they're most likely toys. That's the first impression I get from this. At an 1833 house in northern Albemarle County, 2 interesting concealed artifacts were recovered from within the structure. The first item is a hand-carved wooden peg inscribed with the date of 1833. The peg was recovered from the attic, hidden behind the chimney brickwork. This peg is on either side, and here's just the reverse side of the peg that's blank. And then in the middle, we have an example of it's very interesting in its origin, we think. It's a brass Coptic cross, which was hidden in the chimney mortar in the attic space. Crosses of this style are commonly, or had commonly originated in northern Africa during the 19th century. It's likely that these items were hidden by the house builder or workman in 1833, one that memorializes the date that the structure was built, and the second item here was most likely placed there for apotropaic purposes to serve as a good luck charm over the residence or the house itself. In eastern Orange County, a builder's board was recovered from the Center Hill house dating to the early 1850s. The artifact was found after removing finished lath and plaster over a first floor wall cavity. The board clearly displays the name of the master carpenter, which is Hobart Terrell, which is his name is here. And his work crew, Marshall P. Mason, William W. Downs, Ben Brown, Anderson Collins, James Colvin, and W. D. Rawson, as well as presumably enslaved Negro workers, Anderson, Frederick, and Frank. Builders' boards encapsulated within cavities in buildings is a practice that is still practiced to some degree in modern times. With the high number of intact 19th century timber frames in Orange County and surrounding counties, this is an artifact that is likely to still have a rather high frequency of being located out there on the landscape for potential study. In nearby Madison County, the James L. Kemper residential complex produced a few artifacts that had been concealed. A doll was found in the log slave quarter at the Kemper residence. This doll was found to the right of the chimney on the gable end in the chink joint between logs. A small iron knife with a bent tang, as you can see here. This knife was also found in the same slave quarter. It had been hidden in the gable end opposite from where the doll was found within the structure. The bending of the tang on the knife we think is probably meaningful and may have been a part of the concealment ritual itself. Iron artifacts were very commonly used by enslaved folks as a part of some of their ritual activity. We've been able to determine in various places across the South. And all of these artifacts are associated with a 19th century date. An interesting inscription was found on the summer beam of an 1804 house in Albemarle County. The summer beam is a primary load-bearing member of a timber frame structure. The inscription consists of a series of initials surmounted over the date of 1804, which references the construction date of the house. And this inscription is surrounded by this cartouche, which is in the form of a two-story house. And due to the location on the summer beam that this inscription occupies, it only could have been put there during construction of the house. It could not have been inscribed there after the house was built and finished. A rare witch bottle was discovered recently during an archaeological excavation conducted by the Virginia Department of Transportation from Redoubt No. 9 near Williamsburg. Witch bottles have typically been recovered from mid-16th to 18th century contexts in the United States and Great Britain. These apotropaic artifacts were intended as sympathetic magic to counter effects of evil spells of witches or to protect a house or person from malevolent forces. Witch bottles, in addition to containing iron nails or metal pins, also contained human hair, fingernail clippings, and human urine. Sometimes leather or other fabric was also included in the contents of a witch bottle. The intent was to place the full witch bottle in a fireplace, and as it heated, the witch would experience pain. As the bottle, or after the bottle exploded, the witch would die. That was the superstition that was tied to witch bottles. Redoubt No. 9 is a small Civil War fort located in the median of Interstate 64. The redoubt site also contained a soldiers' camp dating to 1862. The witch bottle consisted of an aqua glass bottle hidden in a fireplace hearth. From this particular location, the interior of the hearth is here. I believe the witch bottle was dug up, found in that location in the corner of the hearth. So this is in the fireplace hearth of the soldiers' hut, and from documentary research, soldiers that were encamped here in 1862 were from Pennsylvania. The bottle was manufactured in Pennsylvania. A small handful of other witch bottles have also been confirmed and were recovered from Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware over the past 20 to 30 years. One final example from Sweetwater in East Tennessee, my hometown of about 5,000. found a hoard of concealed artifacts, memorabilia, ephemera, consisting of numerous glass photo negatives, newspapers and documents, costuming, clothing, photographs, glass bottles, and etc. Much of this cache is directly associated with the early history of the Tennessee Military Institute, TMI, during the first decade of the 20th century. The home was constructed in 1905 for the second president or headmaster of TMI, a Colonel O.C. Hulvey, who was a native of Stanton, Virginia. The artifacts were found under insulation and flooring in the attic and were well preserved. It is unlikely that the artifacts were hidden for an apotropaic purpose or a ritual purpose, but they were likely deposited there as some sort of time capsule, although the items were randomly scattered throughout the attic space and under the flooring. These photos don't even encapsulate the full range of different items that were contained in the Hulvey attic, but these glass negatives, especially, I thought were great because they included photographs of construction of the house that these things were found in, and very, very early photographs of TMI and the student soldiers who were there in formation, and some parade formation, just photographs of the building, views that had never been seen before, at least in probably in 80 or 100 years. Also, these costumes. It's a Union suit with they sewed on some skirting, and I believe in another article about this cache of artifacts, and there may have also even been a flyer, a paper flyer included in this, was for a minstrel performance that was given at TMI, which was the minstrels were exceedingly popular in the South from the 1890s up through the 30s. So that, I believe, that's what this clothing and costuming is associated with. And there were numerous other, it will probably fill the back of a pickup truck, all the items that were found here in just excellent shape. So in summary, it can be very difficult to distinguish between artifacts that have been hidden as a form of ritual concealment for apotropaic purposes, artifacts intentionally hidden as a method of disposal or preservation, or artifacts that have been casually lost or discarded. Only with more detailed inventory of these type of objects and a full description of the contexts in which they have been found can a usable database begin to be developed. The objects discussed during this presentation fit in all of these categories. Questions?
That was fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. You only showed one blue glass thing, but there's always been a preference for blue glass.
Yes.
And I wonder if that is going to appear more commonly when you get a bigger inventory.
I think, and people know about this stuff. People, homeowners, builders, people that do restoration work, but they never have really thought anything about it. And I bet if some of these folks somebody would just sit down with them and kind of collect all their memories, from a county or a region, then some interesting potential trends would start to develop, and they would say, "Oh wow, we found these 30 artifacts over the years in various and random houses that we've remodeled or tore down." I think another thing that probably didn't come out very well in my short lecture was the placement, where they're placed inside the building in relation to the exterior and in relation to the rest of the structure itself. For instance, where the hexafoils have typically been found, and of course most of the data comes from Great Britain, but there's been a fair amount of these hexafoils scribed on barns, houses, other cabins, other timber frame structures in North America, near doors and windows, in chimneys. It's kind of easy to think of things being hidden by the fireplace,
Right.
because that's a work area.
Right.
And things, for instance, there's a long tradition of, hearth cellars, and burying things at the hearth, but artifacts that are hidden in other parts of the building, around the doors, around the windows, places where there's a transition from exterior to interior. That's a little bit more meaningful, I think, and it's just, we are not. This is not a good way. It's a nice way to inventory, but it's not necessarily a good way to get at the psychology of what they were thinking about, why they did it, and what the actual ritual was. So there's still a lot of room to a lot of things that are going to be unknowable.
Has anybody looked at the correlation with the hexafoils with the Germanic tradition? The Pennsylvania Dutch hex signs, and whether the builders had that tradition?
I'm not aware of any, but they would probably be a good database to study, given that their architecture is particularly long-lived. They don't typically tear down and start from new like the rest of us do. They use and reuse and use some more. Those same buildings that have been on the landscape for 200 years. And I should check with Craig, because he goes up there pretty frequently to get flooring and to get architectural parts from buildings they are tearing down, because they're just so far beyond repair and just can't be salvaged to continue to be lived in. But he's of the opinion, especially, that the hexafoils are fully ritualistic, given just in the different kinds of structures they've been found at, and no matter if you're in a barn or a cabin or a 2-story finer house that's a timber frame, you see these hexafoils in the same spots.
And you said windows, doors, fireplaces?
Windows, doors, chimneys, fireplace, because it's an opening to the exterior.
You notice you're saying everything that's an opening, so to maybe ward evil spirits from coming in.
Potentially.
Yep.
And in some examples in Britain, for instance, I saw photographs of several structures on the door header, and sometimes the sill plate that was exposed. Series of hexafoils, not just one or maybe one or two kind of superimposed, like you started one and you made a mistake, so let me scoot over a couple inches and redo it. This was a series of 6, 8, 10 hexafoils that were executed into the timber framing. And I presume that means, well, we're 5 times better off than just putting one there.
John Woolfolk, was he the owner on that builder's?
Yes, in 1851, I believe that was the date.
You didn't mention him.
He's the owner, Woolfolk, and it was built. John Lafayette Woolfolk. It's down Lahore area, and he was married in 1850, 1851 with a new wife. Had this house built, and what's going to be a good study, and at some point I'm going to do a newsletter article about these guys. I don't know if I can get any information on those guys, but Terrell and his work crew, because surely that wasn't the only house he built.
Exactly. And Terrell's an old name.
It is an old name there.
Yeah.
Old African American name.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Oh, yes. I've always been fascinated by the story of the Kemper doll.
Oh yeah.
And I just.
And there were many other artifacts found in that slave quarter as well that were seemingly hidden. I just didn't have photos of them. There was a serving tray from a silver service that was concealed there as well.
Has the possibility been explored or examined whereby the doll was actually belonged to the slave owner's children and was borrowed and never returned?
It's possible, or a hand-me-down. Yeah, I mean, you could, if it exists, if there's a diary, you know, something like that might show up in a diary, you know, or even a photo. You know, Kemper would have been, I don't know which daughter it was, in, you know, and how old he was, but if, you know, if it was at the right time period, there may be a photograph, a family photograph, where, you know, somebody's holding it in the photo, and, you know, with him being the governor, there may be a photo floating around, a family photo of him.
Did you find evidence where people could actually access these items very easily through like a secret doorway? Or
nope.
So they were sealed in.
These things were fully they were encapsulated in every sense of the word. You could not access them. This may have been a situation. It just depends on, because this was, you know,
It could have been
probably put in from the outside of the building into this hidey hole.
Kids playing and
It could have been, but things like, you know, that's behind plaster and lath and truly in the bowels of the buildings. These carpenter's tools, they could not be accessed one bit, because they were within the wall framing, you know, of the first floor, and you know, my best explanation is that, you know, they were dropped in while the second floor was being finished, you know, down into the void between the exterior wall and the interior wall. Right. Yeah. Oh, well, we lost those hammers. I don't have a hammer. I can't, you know, I got to take a break. These items, again, not accessible under the subfloor on the second story. Certainly wouldn't have a hole in the ceiling on the first floor to get up to these things, and most likely there was no access, you know, from the second floor to access, you know, these things. Now the paper dolls, the finger puppets, I think they were probably hidden or lost, not with any kind of ritual in mind, but just kids. But again, you know, shoes, spoons, ceramics, glass. Most of those shoes are children's shoes of the 9. A couple of them are, and you know, it's always hard for me to, anything I see from the 19th century as far as clothing or coffins or anything that was meant for adults, to me always still looks like a kid's sized thing, because people were so much more diminutive, especially women back in that day. So you really have to look at, you know, compare, you know, okay, this is obviously a child's shoe because it's no bigger than your hand. Yeah, I mean, I excavated a cemetery in Culpeper many years ago, and we had a grave, 1840s, 1850s, and during the field work, during the time it was being excavated, it just so happened to have had a glass viewport, so it was a little bit more ornate coffin, and of course most everything was decayed and gone, but the glass was still there. It was shattered, but it was all in place. It was one of those teardrop style viewports, and the coffin itself was not overly long, and we were able to determine through the physical anthropology analysis that it was a female that was buried in it. And you know, I'm with the deed records and the other archival information, trying to figure out, well, is this a how old is the person, you know, when they died, or about how old. And during the field work, it's like, well, I'm thinking it was probably a 12 to 14 year old child, girl. And you know, all the archival information pointed to a 20-something or early 30-something, woman. And it just, it was just, it's a hard mind, at least for me, a hard mindset to break about the size of things from 150 years ago. Those were adult things, not necessarily using today's reference.
Right.
Yeah, and shoes are the most common, or at least the most recognized. I won't say the most common because we don't really know what the most common is because we've not been looking for this. Once we start looking for it, then that's when we can really find some things out. But the shoes have been most recognized to date. And there's a lady that used to be in Fredericksburg. I think she went to University of Mary Washington. Name's Manning. She's now a museum curator up in Connecticut or Massachusetts, somewhere up that way. And this is her thesis and dissertation topic. It's concealed artifacts and the ritual behind that. And she's generated a pretty extensive kind of geographical distribution set of maps that show that's out there in the literature, and this has only been a few years ago, so it's fairly common. But again, she's probably done the most work of anybody in the United States that I have found. Now in Australia, this topic has been written about a good handful of times. There's a couple of primary sources from the 80s, I think. And why Australia, I don't know. Maybe somebody down there, back decades ago took a fancy to it.
Yeah, exactly.
And then there's been a little bit, or at least what seems like a little bit from England and Germany.
Yeah, I'm surprised Great Britain, if they have been finding this. I mean, they've been finding it a lot longer than we have. That there hasn't been more on it.
Yeah, and maybe it's one of those things that's just kind of it's folklore, but it's kind of taken for granted. Over there, maybe, I don't know. It's the same. It's similar thing with cemeteries in the United States in terms of cultural resource management. Before 20 years ago, we didn't do any kind of study on cemeteries unless it was some big ornate church or high city cemetery with lots of statuary and
Hollywood.
Lots of really complex. The Hollywood Cemetery in Memphis, for instance. 30 acres and all these generals and presidents and et cetera. So, in terms of doing a cultural resources survey, we have a cemetery in our project area. Okay, yeah, that's a cemetery. We know it's a cemetery. It's obvious. It wouldn't even get recorded, at least for cultural resource purposes. But now we have come to understand and recognize that these are resources that need to be recorded and analyzed. Even though it's a cemetery, there are things that you might not realize about the cemetery or about the occupants in the cemetery.